This video is to help you through your notes on chapter 4.3 on carbon cycling. Carbon is one of those super important molecules that you tend to talk about again and again and again in every unit of biology. And that's because it's really what we call the backbone of all of these organic biological macromolecules, these big, huge molecules that are made by and make up living things. So if you've had a biology course before, you should probably know what these things are, and we'll do a quick review of that. If not, then that's okay. We'll be learning a lot about this later. So what we're looking at here is a carbon-based molecule with what we call a carboxyl group, an amine group, and then a functional group here. And this is an amino acid. Amino acids, of course, are the small units of proteins. All right, here this funky looking molecule has a phosphate group, some kind of 5-sided sugar, and a base. I don't see any carbons here. Well, that's because carbons, when they're drawn in sugars, are often left out of these corners here. And so, trust me, there's carbons there. They're just not in the drawing. And this is a nucleotide. Nucleotides make up the monomers or the base units of things like DNA, RNA, or nucleic acids. Okay, so over here we've got a carbon-based molecule, okay, made up of a molecule of glycerol and 1, 2, 3 fatty acids. This is a triglyceride or lipid. And down here at the bottom, we've kind of already alluded to these ring-shaped structures, okay, but here we can actually see the carbons that make up the most of the corners there. And these are, of course, our sugars or our simple carbohydrates. You may also see that referred to as monosaccharide. If you don't know what that is, that's okay. We'll be talking a lot about those later. So just a quick review here of why we're talking about carbon and why it's so important for all of the living things. So we know that carbon is super important for all life forms, but where do we actually find it? Well, the answer there is everywhere. Okay, we're going to find it in a couple of different places on Earth, one being the hydrosphere, hydro meaning water. We're going to talk about how carbon interacts with marine and other aquatic environments. In the biosphere, okay, bio meaning life, that's the area where living things reside. In the lithosphere, litho meaning rocks, so rocks seem really boring, but there's actually a lot of stuff going on in there, and quite a few of them are made using parts of living things. More on that later. And of course, we know carbon is in the atmosphere. Tons of carbon making up different molecules residing here in the atmosphere. So we've previously spoken about these organisms called autotrophs and what kinds of things they do in their environment. Okay, they play a very important role in the carbon cycle. So remember, energy flows through an ecosystem, okay, comes in via solar energy, okay, it gets transformed into chemical energy and it eventually leaves in the form of heat. Nutrients like carbon, however, cycle through our ecosystems because Earth is closed, okay, it's a closed system. No more carbon comes in, carbon doesn't leave, okay, nutrients like carbon just get cycled. And autotrophs are extremely important in the carbon cycle because they absorb inorganic carbon dioxide and convert it into organic carbon-based compounds. And by that, we mean usually sugars, okay? Or we can turn those sugars into starches, okay? But they're basically taking the carbon that's in the atmosphere, inorganic, and converting it into an organic sugar. And once it's in the form of a sugar, then it can be eaten by consumers, and that energy is then ready to pass on through our food chains. Now, when we talk about the carbon cycle, it's easy to get caught up in the trap of only thinking that carbon is in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, or in the form of sugars once that carbon dioxide has been transformed by autotrophs. What's interesting about that thought is that Earth is primarily covered with water. Aquatic ecosystems make up the vast majority of biomass or biosystems on Earth. So we really need to closely consider what's happening with carbon in those environments. Now, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere can dissolve into water, okay? Liquids, like water, can hold a certain amount of dissolved gases, carbon dioxide being one of them. When carbon dioxide gets absorbed by water, it does this really tricky thing. It forms an acid called carbonic acid, and it causes the pH of that water to drop. So we know that pH runs on a scale from 0 to 14, with 7 being a neutral in the middle. Here are all of the acids over here. Okay, so when we absorb carbon dioxide into a liquid, that pH starts creeping closer and closer to this 0 mark. Okay, it's also why if you take the pH of a carbonated beverage, like a soda, okay, that's liquid that has had carbon dioxide molecules forced into it, you're going to find they have a pH of about 2 to 3. They're very acidic. This all sounds well and good, okay, but one of the things that we know about our environment is that it's changing. And one of the changes that we're noticing is that there's more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In this chapter, we'll talk more about why that happens, but human activities are releasing record amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Well, that means record amounts of carbon dioxide are being absorbed by the water. That means that the pH of this water, like in the oceans, is dropping. And that may not seem like it's such a big deal, but that's because you and I don't have these things. We don't have shells. And shells of aquatic organisms are made of what we call calcium bicarbonate. And that material is very susceptible to decreasing or acidic pHs. So this acidic water literally dissolves these shells, weakening them, making them more prone to injury or predation. So a very big problem here dealing with the acidification of oceans. Okay, so autotrophs, like plants, need carbon dioxide, okay? Most of them perform photosynthesis, and so that equation looks like this. Okay, so they require carbon dioxide. Producers, okay, are also called autotrophs, okay? So producers, autotrophs, need that carbon dioxide to perform photosynthesis. How are they getting those molecules of carbon dioxide? Well, that depends on where they live. So this word terrestrial means land. So these land plants, land algae, land photosynthetic bacteria are obtaining carbon dioxide by absorbing it from the air. Aquatic producers, so plants, algae, things like that that live in the water that still need this carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, are absorbing it from the water. Okay, so the same equation holds true, but depending on where producer lives, they might be getting that carbon dioxide from different sources. Okay, so we've talked about the carbon cycle enough. It's now time for me to draw an incredibly embarrassing, terrible version of the carbon cycle that includes animals and plants I'm sure you won't be able to recognize. I want to make sure that I tell you ahead of time, though, this doesn't include every aspect of the carbon cycle. I'm only going to include the parts that we're going to talk about the most, okay? So we need a couple of different environments here. I'm going to draw an aquatic environment. So here's a lake. Wow, this is going to be interesting. There are some plants in here. What are some other things that live in lakes? Okay, fish. Okay, there we go, a fish. Great. And then, of course, we have the land. Okay, and let's see, here's a tree that lives on land. Okay, here's, I don't know, a cow. That's a cow. Look, I know it's a cow because it has spots and it's smiling. Okay, and then I'm going to draw, I don't know, what do cows need? Do cows live in houses? Sure, this cow's going to live in a house. Okay, and he's going to burn fossil fuels for energy. We're just going to make believe like that's a real thing. Okay, so we need to think about the atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide, or the carbon cycle really kind of centers around the atmosphere. And carbon in the atmosphere is present in many different forms, but the predominant one that we're going to talk about is carbon dioxide. Okay, so first I want to talk about processes that absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Well, first of all, carbon dioxide is readily absorbed by water. Okay, we talked about that on the last slide. And then that again is absorbed by aquatic plants. Okay, and terrestrial plants via the process of photosynthesis. Okay, now that carbon dioxide, okay, gets transformed from an inorganic molecule to organic molecules in the form of sugar. And those sugars then make their way into consumers via consumption. Okay, so I'm not going to write that down. I think that's pretty obvious that those arrows represent consumption. How does that carbon return to the atmosphere? Well, when these organisms use that sugar to make energy in the form of ATP, they're using the process of cellular respiration. And you don't have to write this down, but just to remind you, cellular respiration, well, that's wrong. Don't write that because that's wrong. Cellular respiration takes glucose, C6H12O6, so here are all of our glucoses, and oxygen, and converts that into water, carbon dioxide, plus ATP energy, plus heat energy. Okay, so we're taking them from the glucose and the consumers, and we're producing carbon dioxide. And that, of course, is going to return to the atmosphere here. Okay, and that is the process of cellular respiration. Okay, so why did I draw this house here? Okay, well, it's because I didn't want to draw a factory, or I guess I could have drawn a car. But one of the other processes that we're going to talk a lot about is the burning of fossil fuels. So I'm just going to go ahead and write that. Burning, hopefully you have more room than I do, of fossil fuels. And that again is going to take carbon out of things, okay? And when we burn them, it's going to release that back into the atmosphere. Okay, so if we go back and answer these questions, okay, what processes absorb carbon dioxide? Well, that would be photosynthesis. Processes that release carbon dioxide, the two that we've included in this diagram are cellular respiration and burning of fossil fuels. Are there others? You betcha. We're just not going to put them on this diagram yet. So in terms of the carbon cycle, carbon dioxide, CO2, gets all the love, gets all the attention. There's another important carbon compound in the atmosphere, though, called methane, CH4. And it's going to be really important when we start talking about greenhouse gases and such, okay? Methane is a relatively small molecule, and it's produced in one of two ways. It's produced, well, I guess only by one way, only by specialized microbes or bacteria, but in two major common areas. And one is in wetlands, okay, in anaerobic conditions, so conditions without oxygen, and in the digestive tracts of mammals. So if you've ever tried to light one of your farts on fire, which I don't recommend, The reason that they're flammable is because in our digestive tracts, you, cows, all mammals, in our digestive tracts live these little microbes, and microbes take some of the food that you eat, and through their metabolic processes, they produce methane. Methane is flammable. Okay, so we've got wetlands, digestive tracts of mammals, okay, as our major producers of methane. And we'll talk more about that later. I just wanted to point out that carbon dioxide is not the only carbon molecule that we find that's part of the carbon cycle. So when we talk about cellular respiration, again, C6H12O6 plus oxygen gives you carbon dioxide and water. Okay, we often talk about burning calories. Well, that's what's happening with cellular respiration. We are literally burning this glucose, okay, and it produces carbon dioxide. Now, when we talk about methane, okay, methane can also be burned. We talk about it's flammable. Methane, which we find in natural gas, also produces carbon dioxide when we burn it. Okay, so even though this isn't carbon dioxide itself, it's present in the atmosphere. Plus, when we burn it, it also produces carbon dioxide. So again, always coming back to this concept of releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. In our diagram of the carbon cycle, we mentioned burning fossil fuels. So when we think of fossil fuels, I know most people think of gasoline. That is not the only fossil fuel. In fact, one of the common types of fossil fuels we see here in Pennsylvania is something called peat. You can buy it at the garden center at your local grocery store. Peat is a type of waterlogged soil, so soil that's saturated with a lot of water, and it contains large amounts of partially decomposed organic matter. So in other words, dead things that have partially decayed. And you can actually burn that peat as a fuel source. So how does that work? Okay, well, let's go back and talk about how peat is formed in the first place. So first, dead organisms are covered in water. So dead things accumulate at the bottom of some kind of body of water, and they have to be covered with water. They have to stay covered. So intertidal zones and periodic water coverings aren't going to work. The weight of the water actually forces the air out of that dead organic matter. So imagine taking a pile of dead stuff and squishing it, squeezing all of the air out. That's going to create what we call an anaerobic environment. And anaerobic means without oxygen. Okay, we need to get out of this habit of thinking that means without air. Anaerobic means without oxygen. Well, without oxygen, things can't decay. So detritivores, saprotrophs, decomposing bacteria, all of those things rely on the process of cellular respiration. And again, cellular respiration is glucose plus oxygen. Oh, I shouldn't have written these in words. Whoops. Gives us carbon dioxide and water plus a whole crap load of energy release. Okay, if we don't have oxygen, then we can't do this process. And if we can't do that process, then we can't break down that organic matter. So that stuff just kind of sits there. And stuff that would normally decompose, okay, dies off, and we're left with these energy-rich compounds. Again, because that glucose that's found in those dead bodies hasn't been decayed yet. It's still there. It still contains that energy. And it gets compressed and preserved. And over time, we start to get this stuff known as peat. So peat is probably sounding pretty awesome right about now. And it is super awesome. It has a lot of energy. But here's the problem. First of all, to get it, to harvest it, you gotta dig stuff up. Remember, it's covered by water. It's covered with a lot of weight. So you're gonna have to remove water or remove topsoil in order to get underneath of there. And those are usually very sensitive areas like wetlands that are home to things like birds and fish and very sensitive organisms. And the second problem with peat is that in order to use it for energy, you have to burn it. And burning it is going to release carbon dioxide. Okay, so kind of another process that's accidentally resulting in carbon dioxide accumulation in our atmosphere. Now, if you were to not dig up peat and you were going to let it sit for, I don't know, a few more million years, then you may be lucky enough to witness the formation of another type of fossil fuel, and those are our oils and gases. Okay, so here's how we form oil and gas, and there's a reason why we're learning this. We'll get to that later. Peat, which we've already learned about, gets trapped under layers of non-porous sedimentary rock. Okay, well, what are pores? Pores are holes. Okay, so if I have something that is non-porous, that means no holes. The reason why that's important is because we need to create an anaerobic environment. We need to maintain that anaerobic environment so that decomposers don't have oxygen and go in there and decompose all of that energy-rich compound. If this rock that was piling up on top of here had holes in it, then oxygen could potentially leak in here and cause us to not be undecayed matter. Okay, it would lose its energy properties as far as usefulness for us. Over long periods of time, and I don't mean like the period of time it takes me to get through talking about these videos, I mean like millions and millions of years, the heat and the pressure from this rock keeps pushing and condensing that peat into really dense hydrocarbons known as oil and gas. Okay, so this is like peat for really patient people. Now, oil and natural gas and fossil fuels are awesome. I'm not gonna lie. I enjoy my car starting when I push the button. I enjoy my hairdryer turning on because my electricity is working. Okay, we all use the benefits of oil and fossil fuels. They're very energy rich, okay, and they provide lots of usable energy, but again, some major drawbacks with them. One of them has to do with disrupting major habitats. So this non-porous rock that's sitting on top of this awesome fossil fuel has to be removed before we can get it out of here. So huge amounts of disruption. And again, in order to use them, you have to burn them. Okay, when you burn them, that releases carbon dioxide into the air. Don't be fooled by things that claim to be clean, like clean coal. That means they're not releasing like bits of coal dust into the air. They are still releasing just as much carbon dioxide as before. So I guess it depends on what your version of clean means, but be careful. It doesn't matter what kind of clean or green technology you're using, that carbon dioxide is still being released and you still have to go get them in the first place. So we hear a lot in the news and in elections and all kinds of places about our reliance on fossil fuels and the thought that perhaps we should reconsider renewable energy sources. Well, wait a minute. If fossil fuels are made from dead things that have just been compressed, then why don't we consider those renewable? There's no shortage of dead things on the planet. There never will be because that's the cycle of life. So why aren't those fossil fuels considered renewable? Well, it's because it takes them too long to form. We are using them at an exponentially faster rate than they're being produced. So they're not reusable because they're taking very long periods of time to get replenished. If you keep up with the news, then you may have noticed this new trend in something called biomass plants. Biomass plants are kind of like the new hipster environmentalist bio or power plant. They seem really cool, and they are cool. The thought is, let's take things that we're not using, like trash or leaves, Or let's take things that can grow back that are renewable, like wood, and let's burn those instead of burning things like coal, oil, natural gas. That sounds amazing. Again, don't be fooled. Think about this. It doesn't matter what you're burning. Biomass, fossil fuels, biofuels, does not matter. Anytime you are burning something, you are releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You are taking the carbon that is in the glucose of those organisms, putting it in the presence of oxygen. You are releasing the carbon in the form of carbon dioxide and water and energy. So again, the thought is to harness this energy, but in the process, you're producing carbon dioxide, and it does not matter what you're burning. So wait a minute. If you're producing carbon dioxide no matter what you're burning, then what's all the rage with these new things called biofuels? What's that all about? Well, biofuels are actually really cool. We can take things that grow relatively quickly, like corn, okay, and we can turn them into fuels. Again, that still releases carbon dioxide, but the cycle of returning that carbon from the atmosphere is much, much shorter. So if we go back to thinking about our carbon cycle diagram, when I burn this biofuel, it's going to release carbon dioxide into the environment, into the atmosphere, for sure, no question about it. But this is coming from a plant with a relatively fast growth rate. And so that carbon dioxide will very shortly be reabsorbed via photosynthesis by those plants. If I'm thinking about the carbon dioxide or the carbon cycle in terms of fossil fuels, well, fossil fuels, I'm releasing that carbon dioxide all the time, but it's taking hundreds of millions of years for that carbon dioxide to return to the ground as a fossil fuel. So that cycle time is a lot shorter. So earlier we were talking about the lithosphere and rocks. Well, what does this carbon cycle have to do with rocks? And how are rocks helping us to absorb carbon from the atmosphere? Well, in order to understand that, we have to look at this cool rock called limestone. Limestone's pretty cool. It looks like this. It's white. You'll often see it making up cliffs. If you've ever been anywhere like near the Mediterranean, you'll see a lot of buildings made of limestone. It's pretty cool stuff. It is an inorganic carbon compound, okay, made mostly up of the same stuff that makes up chalk. Now, how did we get this limestone? Well, this limestone used to be the shells of marine organisms. So it's an inorganic compound that is made by living things. And the production of limestone pretty much goes something like this. We have carbon dioxide in the environment, okay? Those marine organisms are going to absorb some of that carbon dioxide in order to make their shells, okay? Eventually, sad story, all of these animals are going to die, and those shells, those empty shells, are going to start to accumulate and build up here on the ocean floor. Now, more and more shells of dead organisms are going to build up on top of them. So I'm going to form this layer of empty shells. Again, here comes our non-porous sedimentary rock. Okay, so we're going to get some sedimentary rock forming on the top of these things. So here come my layers of sedimentary rock. And what this is going to do is it's going to trap those dead, well, they're not dead anymore, those empty shells under some very heavy rock. And again, over millions and millions of years, the heat and the pressure from those shells, or from the non-porous sedimentary rock, is going to crush these shells and compress them into limestone, squish them into limestone. So who really gives a flip? And why on earth is your biology teacher rambling on and on and on about rocks? Great question. Okay, this limestone formation is a really important step in something that we call biosequestration. Okay, if you sequester something, so if you've ever learned about our judicial system and we talk about sequestering a jury, if I have to be on a jury and I get sequestered, that means that they're going to keep me away. Okay, they're going to lock me up in a room with all of the other jurors, away from news outlets, away from Facebook, away from the internet, and we're locked there until we make a decision. Okay, well, what does this have to do with this? Okay, well, biosequestration, so living things, bio-living, is when we're removing and locking that carbon away from the environment in a substance for an extended period of time. And that has to be done by a living thing. Okay, so biosequestration, kind of when a living or a process that involves living things locks up that carbon for long periods of time. And that's super important because, again, it took carbon dioxide from the atmosphere out here and it locked it up in this limestone for millions and millions of years. Well, what does limestone have to do with our carbon cycle if it's locked up? Well, because we're messing all that up. When we mine limestone and crush it up, what we're primarily using it for is concrete. I don't know about you. I enjoy having sidewalks to walk on or walls to build, all kinds of things. So I use concrete just as much as anybody else. But we have to be mindful of that, again, because when we crush it to make this concrete here, we are then releasing all of that carbon dioxide that has been sequestered back into the atmosphere. So it's been locked up here for hundreds of millions of years, and now we are rapidly releasing it back into the environment. All right, we're almost at the end of this chapter on carbon cycling, and this is a graph that you're definitely going to want to invest some time in thinking about. Okay, this graph comes from a place called Mauna Loa, super cool place. Put it on your travel to-do list. That's an volcanic mountain on the big island of Hawaii. One of the coolest places I've ever been. Spectacular stargazing. And many of the world's top telescopes are actually located on the top. And NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, has a bunch of cool stuff up here, one of which is a carbon dioxide sensor. So what we're looking at here in this graph, okay, is the carbon data over the long term. So as we progress throughout time, we can see a general trend upward. So if I had to describe the pattern in this graph, I would say since 1960, well, from 1960 to 2010, there has been a general increase in the carbon dioxide levels in parts per million. Now, if I zoom in on a particular portion of this graph, okay, what I can do is take a closer look at it over here. All right, so over here we're looking at different years. Again, the black is the general trend, so still going up. But wait a minute, what is this funky stuff? Within a certain year, we see this roller coaster motion, this up, down, up, down, up, down motion. What the heck is that all about? Well, let's take a closer look at what's really going on here. This graph can be a little bit difficult to read, so I'm going to kind of split these up a little bit. Let's talk about 2013. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 marks in a year. This next mark belongs to 2014, so I'm not going to count that. There are 4 marks in a year. Okay, well, there are 12 months in a year. There's 4 marks for that year, so each one of these marks must be every 3 months. Okay, every 3 months. Well, this first check mark or tick mark must be January. Then in between must be February, March. That would mean this is April, and then we would go May, June, then July, and then August, September, and then this would be October, and if I did this right, November and December would be here, and we start back at January the next year. All right, so I can see that my carbon dioxide levels are really fluctuating here. What is going on? Well, I'll tell you this has to do a lot with the natural cycles of things that absorb carbon dioxide. And you guessed it, those are our plants, okay, and our other producers. Plants, remember, absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So when a lot of plants are growing, we should see carbon dioxide levels go down. Okay, well, does that match up with what we're seeing here in our data? Okay, carbon dioxide levels really start to decrease right around here. Yeah, in June it looks like is maybe our peak carbon dioxide levels. They start to fall right around in here. So at the second part of, and let me change this color real quick. So this decrease here is going to correspond with our summer and fall seasons, okay? These are when our plants are really growing, really producing, really absorbing a lot of carbon dioxide. So if there's a lot of plant growth and photosynthesis going on in here, then that's going to really pull down our carbon dioxide levels, decrease those carbon dioxide levels. On the other hand, in January, so the middle of winter, and early spring, we don't really have very many plants that are growing and growing and photosynthesizing and absorbing a lot of carbon dioxide. That's not really going on so much. Okay, so this is going to be our winter and fall part of our graph. Or sorry, not winter and fall. How come no one corrected me there? Our winter and early spring graph. Okay, we're really going to see quite an increase in our carbon dioxide levels because it's winter and early spring and there aren't any plants to absorb that carbon dioxide level. Okay, so it's going up because we have less plants. It's going up because we have less photosynthesis. It's going up because not as much carbon dioxide is being absorbed by the plants. So most of it is remaining in our atmosphere. When plants start to grow, okay, start to regain their leaves and photosynthesize, carbon dioxide levels go down because there are more plants doing more photosynthesis, absorbing more carbon dioxide. If you have any questions about that, make sure that you see me about that in class. And that'll do it for chapter 4.3 on carbon cycling.